Okay, folks, this is take number 5 on your audio lecture for Chapter 6, Lesson 12. I've been playing around with a lot of different software to capture audio on these PowerPoint lectures. Miracosta uses a software called what is it, Smith Relay or whatever it is. It's very hard to use, and quite frankly, I don't like it. So I'm trying another software called Screencast. So we'll see how this one works out. Anyway, this lecture is on Chapter 6, the illicit drug trade. I am using the text publisher's PowerPoint as a resource. I cannot edit it, even though I have tried. I've tried to embed different resource links into it. But when I tried to save it, it wouldn't let me save. So consequently, I have added your resource links to your lesson plan in Blackboard. So this is going to be straight lecture without links to any resources. So please check the lesson plan for your resource links. Okay, let's start and talk about the early drug problem, drug regulation. Up until the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, there were absolutely no controls over food production, manufacturing, packaging, distribution, as well as your medicines. Same thing. Absolutely no controls over what the quantity and quality of substances went into your medicines. I talked about Teddy Roosevelt. And when he was president of the United States at the turn of the century, one morning he was eating breakfast at the White House and was dining on eggs and sausages. And during this time, he was reading a book that was very popular at the time called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And in that book, Sinclair writes an expose on the slaughterhouse and meatpacking industry in Chicago and the Midwest. And in that book, he cites several examples of the horrific working conditions that people were faced to work under and the totally disgusting, unsanitary conditions in which meat was packaged and distributed to the American consumer. And in that, he cited a number of examples of workers falling into grinding machines or people getting their fingers, hands, and limbs caught in it and grinding it up and packing it into the different meat products. So he was absolutely appalled. He was horrified at this situation. So he pushed for this Pure Food and Drug Act, got it through Congress, and the act became ratified in 1906. And like I said before, this act is a federal law. It's a mandate for the inspection of meat products and forbids the sales, manufacturing, transportation of poisonous patent medicines and adulterated food products. The Pure Food and Drug Act was the first of more than 200 federal laws that constitute one of the world's most inclusive and operative networks of consumer protections and public health concerns. The purpose of the Pure Food and Drug Act was to protect the American public from products identified as healthy without a scientific basis for that support. The act also aimed to protect against the adulteration of food, which I find to be a little hypocritical because our food is definitely adulterated, but maybe not to the degree and severity as it was then. The act also implemented to curb the spread of disease of food-induced illnesses. We still have salmonella when the cows get into the cabbage patch and poop all over the lettuce and spinach. You also have problems with salmonella with chicken and unclean restaurant situations. So we still suffer from these same situations, but nevertheless, it's a lot better now than it was then. The Pure Food and Drug Act aimed at cleaning up the American food and drug industry. At the turn of the 20th century, America's food supply was enshrouded in unsafe and disgusting working conditions and practices. Diseases were rampant as American slaughter and packing houses were not regulated nor checked for sanitation purposes. At this time, there were no laws permitting the government to inspect these hubs and food processing plants, and as a result, these filthy stations processed and packaged food, then shipped the product throughout the country. So, I mean, the end result was that the was the delivery of an unsanitary, potentially deadly food product. A heightened public awareness during this early 20th century with the likes of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair helped expose these problems. And regarding the issues surrounding careless food preparation, the growing rate of drug addictions from patent medicines influenced the government to create and subsequently pass the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Although the public outcry was substantial, it was sparked by federal employees. They ended up conducted a number of research findings and found that the food and preparation of the meat industry was horrible. Uh, so what happened was when this act came about, President Roosevelt ended up implementing food and drug safety protocols by ensuring the legislation and the act applied to all food products shipped in foreign or interstate commerce. And it eliminated misbranding or adulteration from occurring. The federal government defined alteration for confectionery products, your candies. Adulteration occurred when the product yields any poisonous type of colors, flavors, or any ingredients that are regarded as harmful. Food products were considered adulterated if the goods contained or composed of filthy animal matter or byproducts. The Pure Food and Drug Act required that all drugs be shipped and stored in commercial shelves with clearly readable warning labels. These warning labels needed to notify the user of any habit-forming drugs within the product or any damaging side effects. So the act required that all prescriptions be supplied and affirmed only by licensed physicians. If the prescription wasn't given by a licensed physician, the patient would be disallowed from purchasing the drug. Pure Food and Drug Act prohibited the delivery of diseased or otherwise rotten food in interstate or foreign commerce. And the act also banned the use of spoiled vegetables in animal products. Food was not to be delivered with substituted ingredients that would irritate or harm or add harmful ingredients. So it changed things quite a bit. Now, going to medications. You got to remember the principal medication that was used, the elixir for everything. It was a medication called laudanum, and basically laudanum was a combination of wine, saffron, clove, with a base of opium, cocaine, and then sometimes cannabis. So it would contain one or all three of those ingredients, and that was your foundational medication that was used extensively throughout the world, if you will, globally, up until about the early 1900s. It created a number of addicts in the United States as well as globally because they became hooked on opium. It was introduced on a wide scale at the end of the Civil War for soldiers that were severely wounded and faced amputation. They were given a heavy dosage of opium and continued to use it to deal with their pain following surgery. So it developed a form of addiction to them. It was widely prescribed to women who were suffering from menstrual cramps, teething babies, any type of pain or affliction that you may have, melancholy, depression, what have you. An opium-based product was prescribed, so consequently resulted in a large number of addicted population in the United States and worldwide. When the Harrison Narcotics Act came about, it was a result of an international meeting where the countries had come together and were trying to deal with this issue of addiction. And basically, the act was to provide the registration of with the Internal Revenue Service and impose a special tax on all persons who produce, import, manufacture, deal, dispense, sell, distribute, or give away opium or cocoa leaves, their salts, derivatives, or preparations for other purposes. So basically, those medications that contained opium and cocaine were subject to heavy tax by those that prescribed, manufactured, sold, dispensed, etc. It wasn't targeted at the consuming population. So your pharmacists, your manufacturers are the ones that had to deal in this tax. So subsequently, because they had to pay money, they started manufacturing less of this type of baseline drug. Also at this time, other drugs were put into production to basically alleviate these types of drugs and the addiction potential involved in it. So you found that people that became addicted to these heavy opiates slowly started to diminish up until about the 1940s and 50s. So you're following World War II. People started abusing marijuana and cocaine, particularly in the entertainment and the music industry. So that started to rise through the 50s, and it came to a peak in the 60s and 70s. And now it's continued on to other drugs. You had your methamphetamine, your crack cocaine, your rave drugs, your pharmaceuticals, LSD, et cetera, et cetera. So it hasn't ended. It just has compounded itself. Okay, so we talk about the cycle of disorder. Cycle of disorder is what I explained in our discussion in class regarding broken windows. And when you get a community that loses its self-respect for property values, you have slum or absentee landlords, buildings, businesses go into disrepair, maintenance isn't maintained, it consequently attracts a criminal element. It starts off with vandalism that doesn't get addressed, such as graffiti. You're finding it attracts synergistic crime with drug dealing becomes more visible, prostitution, crimes that perpetuate themselves with drugs and prostitution is violence, assault, robbery, theft. So basically these areas that condone this type of behavior or don't address the problem become a public nuisance. And you find it in the inner city, you find it in suburbia, and it's up to the individual communities to address these problems. You can address it by both formal and informal community control. Counties, cities have code enforcement that regulate these types of situations. Of course, you have the police department. If there's crime that is abundant in these areas, usually they're targeted for enforcement. Going back to the community and code enforcement, if an area becomes a public nuisance, a building, a house, a residence, a business, the city can or county can initiate abatement proceedings and notify the owner or the interested parties if they don't correct it. The property, business, or building can be seized. So, and then auctioned off. So there's a number of fail-safe mechanisms in order to help alleviate this so-called cycle of disorder. Drugs and violent crime go together. When we talk about violent crime and drugs, you first of all have to talk about intramural violence, and that's aggression or violence among drug traffickers that's directed at each other. You have conflict and battles over turf, over particular types of drugs, drug runners, drug sellers. So they are in battle or in conflict with themselves. They want to with themselves. They want to take over a monopolistic situation by controlling those particular areas and turf. You got intramural violence, which is aggression or conflict against law enforcement by the drug traffickers. So it's aggression, violence towards the police. We talk about drug trafficking organizations. You have your core, secondary, and local organizations. Your core organization would be exemplified by your cartels, where they may control the production, manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, storage, and ultimately distribution or sales of a particularly drug product. Or they can rely on a secondary organization that's in contract with them that can take any one of those different characteristics of production, transportation, storage, or sales. You've got your local distributors that can also contract with the secondary group, very typical of your street corner or street level dealers. The people that are involved in the drug business, you have organized crime groups. You've got those groups that are on a manufacturing end, refiners, wholesalers, transporters. Your book mentions the Sicilian Mafia being involved with the majority of heroin deals on the East Coast, and that may be true. I don't think it is as much anymore. There's so much independent drug cartels that are out there nowadays that I don't think the Sicilian Mafia is quite the player that it used to be. You've got the Russians that are heavily involved that control a lot of the drug trade coming out of the Middle East and particularly in Europe. You've got your Asian organized crime groups that control it in the Far East. You got the Mexican cartels and your Colombian cartels in South America that control the drug flow from those areas up in the United States. So the mafia is not one of the principal players anymore. They're involved, but quite frankly, I don't think they're that important. So this book, I think, it misrepresents their involvement in this. Other groups, you may find a group that may be in contract. It's maybe a secondary group down to your local group where, let's say, a Mexican cartel, they want to distribute methamphetamine or some type of pharmaceuticals up here in San Diego County. Well, in order to do that, they're going to have to make contact with the Mexican mafia and form a contract in order to distribute the drugs, in which the Mexican mafia will work as a secondary organization in order to get money and profits from that. Otherwise, you're going to have a drug war between cartel members and the Mexican mafia. So there's other groups that are involved in this. So you have your core group. Secondary groups are very, very important. The business of drugs, it's cold, it's calculating, it's a money-driven business. Very similar to prostitution. It operates 7 days a week, sometimes 24 hours a day, all year long. And normally these guys have a short career that are involved in it, not only because of the violence, but also because of the fact that sooner or later the police are probably going to catch them, arrest them, and put them in prison. This brings up an interesting concept with the latest election here with Prop 45. Unless it can be proven that those people that have been engaged and arrested for drug dealing have got a violent past, for the most part, they're going to be charged with a misdemeanor and not do any prison time. So they're going to be out on the street. There's not much of a deterrent anymore to not participate in this type of activity. Now, when we talk about the opium trade, opium has been around for thousands of years. It's one of the basic foundational drugs that early man used for both religious and medicinal purposes. You have three major organic compounds. You've got opium, you've got cocaine, and you've got cannabis or marijuana. Those are the three main natural substances that have been used for both religious and medical purposes by early man. We found that opium was first originated around India in the Middle East, made its way to China and Southeast Asia by way of merchants and traders. They began growing the poppy and it flourished in those areas. The poppy, like marijuana, is a survivalist plant. It can grow pole to pole and everywhere in between. So the growing conditions are perfect for it to grow just about anywhere. And originally, opium was used as a painkiller. We call that an analgesic. And it was used to help alleviate pain and suffering, if you will, in both Asia, the Middle East, and in Europe during the medieval times. And it continued up until through the 19th century. Your second Asian geographic area, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, make up the Golden Crescent. The Golden Crescent produces the most amount of opium that's produced in the world. There's over 9,000 metric tons that are produced annually out of Afghanistan. Are Afghanis a bunch of opium addicts or heroin addicts? No, not at all. They're strictly farmers. They use it to, or they grow it to, in order to get money to support their families. After the resin is picked from the poppy plant, it ends up formed into balls, thrown in 2-pound balls, rolled in burlap, and sent into Pakistan and Iran for further processing into pure opium, morphine, and then shipped over to Europe, where it hits labs there, where it is developed into heroin. So the Golden Crescent is by far the greatest producer of heroin in the world. Took a little dip during the years that the Taliban was in control. It's against Islamic law to use it. However, they did grow some of it in order to sell it for profit, to augment their gross national product, if you will. Once we invaded in 2003, production skyrocketed back to its original amount before we invaded. So we haven't seen much of a dip, and it's still the largest producing area. Iran has got one of the heaviest addicted population, believe it or not, for the fact that it's a Muslim country, but Iran has got a very heavy heroin problem. We talk about the different organizations that are involved in drug trafficking. You've got a vertically integrated group that can merge with an organization that's proficient in street level distribution, like I mentioned with the Mexican Mafia. They will control different gang areas, geographic areas, and use these gangs on a street level to distribute the drug. They'll also use different areas as safe houses to store it, and also to collect money as stash houses. Or you can have a horizontal integrated group where you've got one crime organization, a cartel that will absorb another one, another crime organization, and combine forces. So it's magnifies its numbers, it magnifies its importance and its control. Domestic organizations here in the United States, we have one of the dubious distinctions of growing the best marijuana in the world. California, Canada, Sinsemilla style marijuana comes from these areas. Mexico, Southeast Asia, Hawaii, South America used to have a good reputation for growing really good pot, but consequently, the cultivation of marijuana here in California and in Canada has superseded those growing areas. Our pot can contain as much as 15% or more of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, and we grow the best pot. You've got outlaw motorcycle groups, other organized crime groups that manufacture synthetic drugs like LSD, PCP, your rave drugs. I know Israel has been a big producer of that, but once you get a decent chemist that can manufacture this stuff, you'll find organized crime taking it over. And it goes back to our horizontally integrated drug trafficking group. Now we got to talk about our drug control strategies. we in the United States have incorporated just about every one of these strategies that I'm going to enumerate here. So we're going to start off with strategy number one, the expressive law enforcement. And that is where the powers to be have said we are going to allocate and dedicate our law enforcement resources to wage a war on drugs and no holds barred. Well, we've tried to do that. Drug war started with President Nixon's administration, and it's continued on through every administration. There's been a certain percentage of the national budget has gone into this expressive law enforcement philosophy. You've got the creation of a number of different federal agencies and local and regional agencies that dedicate their power to enforce drug-related laws here in the United States. Number two, going after Mr. Big. That's where you try to identify the head of these organizations, develop comprehensive and intensive investigations, including wiretaps using informants, undercover operatives, in order to get the person that's in charge. We've done that. We've taken off a number of cartel members. Very important. We've indicted very important drug leaders. Manuel Noriega, the president of Panama, was arrested and indicted. You still have somebody that's going to come in and fill that void. So you take off one, you cut the head off of one snake, you got another one right behind it. Strategy number three, gang control. Gangs have been the focus of attention since the 1980s, and the amount of violence that is associated with them, with their control for drugs and drug turf. They are dependent on their survival for the money and the profits that are involved in the drug trade. They work in concert with heavily organized crime groups like the Mexican Mafia, other ethnic crime groups, as well as the cartels themselves that employ these guys as street level or secondary level organizations to help them deliver their product. We've got citywide street level drug enforcement. The main intention there is to disrupt the open dealing by driving it back indoors, not make it quite as visible. So, it's a concentrated effort by law enforcement to saturate a particular area where the drug dealing is pretty rampant and very visible. Arresting people, putting enough heat on them to where they're not going to be out there blatantly dealing their drug. Neighborhood crackdowns. This involves a lot of community-style policing where you're reliant on the local community to help you with information and enforcement to a degree, allowing you to use the resources that are within the community. You've got a number of county-wide, city-wide departments that are also in the business of enforcing codes, the city codes, so on and so forth. So it's a combined and effort, if you will, to help eradicate this problem. Drug abuse prevention, that's where you're targeting the user of the product. Let's focus on why these people have to rely on taking drugs in order to exist. It could be economic, it could be medical, it could be psychological. We have rehab centers, probably not enough. I think this is probably one of the low-end budgetary things. It's more in line with the community as far as having these types of resources versus the feds or the state. So the money just isn't there to have these prevention centers. It's mostly done by private corporation. Interdiction, that's been huge. Now, we've had open borders. That was part of our problem for a long time. And with the advent of 9/11, we shut our borders down. They're heavily controlled and regulated. However, we've got 12,000 miles of coastline, and we have a number of smuggling routes established since Prohibition, gun running this goes back to the Revolutionary days. So these routes are well established, and you've got people that exploit these open areas. And Despite the fact that we have a very strong border control compared to what it used to, it still isn't at a point where it's going to affect drug interdiction, if you will. Drugs will still get through. We still see a vast minority. We're short compared to what the amount of drugs that come in. So that is going to conclude this lecture on this lesson. Thank you.